Hey, we are back with a power chat here at Eurelectric's LinkedIn. So welcome on board. Hope you will engage actively in the discussion. Leave your comments, questions below, and we'll do our best to answer them or at least give you some feedback. With me here today, I have Bruce Douglas, who is the CEO of GRA. And Bruce, can you just start by telling me what the heck is GRA?
Sure, Kristian, and thank you so much for the invite to come back here to Eurelectric. It's really an honor to be here. So the GRA is the Global Renewables Alliance. It's the single renewable industry voice at an international level, and we represent 6 technologies, so wind, solar, geothermal and hydropower on the generation side, but interestingly also long duration storage and green hydrogen. We don't believe we can scale renewables without those 2 elements as well.
Right, so a broad portfolio of technologies, including generation technologies, but also flex. I didn't hear you say grids.
Grids, we're looking at grids, and in fact I'll come on to that when we talk about the policy recommendations needed, so the action needed to scale renewables. Of course, new grid infrastructure, but also optimizing existing grid infrastructure. That's where Eurelectric come in as well. The Grids for Speed report, instrumental in pushing those benefits of grids, the urgent need for investment in new grids.
Right, tell me a bit about where did GRA come from? It's a relatively new outfit. Is it out of the renewable energy industry, or what's the background?
Yeah, so in fact, we've been thinking about having an international renewable energy industry group for many years, but only recently in the last 2 years did it become really urgent to have it. And so 2 years ago, we launched it at COP27, that was in Egypt, where the industry associations came together and launched it. And our strapline is together for a clean, just and secure future, which is a bit cheesy, you can say, but also it's very true. You need those technologies together, acting together and collaborating and not competing. In order to have a holistic energy solution. So all the stakeholders we now speak to, so be it financiers, policymakers, NGOs, and of course our industry companies, all recognize the need to work together and have that portfolio effect to scale renewables.
I noticed you said clean, not renewable. What is the vision? Is it an energy system that is 100% renewable, or is it one that is 100% carbon free?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we don't advocate strongly for 100% renewable energy. We think, okay, inevitably that may happen in decades' time, but we're pushing for the scaling of renewables, to deliver that clean energy system. And we believe that we can have the power sector close to or at 100% renewables by mid-century or shortly after. And so that decarbonizes the entire power system globally in that time frame.
Right, and what will your message be to some of the Eurelectric members that are in member states where nuclear plays a significant role today and may also play and probably will play a significant role after 2050?
I mean, with regards to nuclear, our position is, existing nuclear power stations, let's keep them open, even lifetime extensions where it's safe. I mean, that is a, very large and powerful zero carbon generator. Regarding new nuclear capacity, then that, the market should decide. In a level playing field, renewables will much more cost competitive and, of course, more importantly, faster to deploy. So in the urgent need for carbon-free power, especially in this decade, renewables are the only technology can deliver in that time frame.
Right. Let's move to this decade because we formed the vision together of the electric decade, and indeed there is a need for massive scaling of clean technology in the electric 20s. Tell us a bit more about your first big priority, which was this campaign about doubling down on renewables.
Well, actually, it's doubling down on energy efficiency rates and tripling of renewable capacity globally by 2030. But just coming back to your point on electric decade, I mean, Eurelectric is really a leader in that space in pushing electrification of all sectors. And so, we talk about power, but also there's heat, transport and industry, which also need to electrify and decarbonize. And I think Eurelectric's, positions on that are clear and extremely valuable in that context. We're really copying what you're doing globally to push mass electrification, with renewable power globally. So our campaign was, as you said, to triple renewable capacity globally by 2030, which means a total of over 11,000 gigawatts by 2030. Now, to put that in context, and this is the challenge, is that means we'd need to install and connect approximately 3 gigawatts per day, every day, between now and 2030. So that's 3,000 megawatts per day. And you know what 3,000 megawatts looks like. It's approximately 1,000 onshore turbines or 300 offshore turbines per day, every day.
That's a lot. And it shows something about the size and the scope of the challenge. And we need to do all this by 2030. How is that going, globally speaking?
Well, first of all, we're breaking records. We're breaking records every year in terms of renewable energy deployment. But that's not enough. It really isn't enough. It's not going fast enough. So it's about half the annual installed capacity additions, about half of where we need to be. So about 600, 700 instead of close to 1.2, 1.3 terawatts. And it's not happening where it needs to happen. So that means geographically it's concentrated in the developed world. So EU, China and US represent about 85% of clean energy investments, leaving just 15% for developing countries, whereas they represent 2/3 of the population. And finally, the technology mix needs to be right. So it needs to have that holistic portfolio effect of multiple different technologies. So there's variable renewables, wind and solar, with hydropower, geothermal, but also, as I mentioned, with storage and flexibility.
Right. And a doubling compared to what's happening today. I mean, we are, as far as I understand, for instance, in China, really at light speed. So are we talking 2 times light speed that's needed in certain geographies? Or, give us an idea about just how much that needs to let's say, accelerate.
Well, interestingly, and maybe concerning, is the fact that China is one of the only countries that is actually tripling, is really on track for the tripling target and on line with the 1.5 degree pathway for renewable deployment. Many other countries and regions need to catch up and accelerate their renewable deployment. But the tripling globally does not mean tripling in every country or every region. So in Europe, as you know, there's a 42.5% target. It's about 2.5 increase. But in other regions such as MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa, they can go 6 or even 10 times what the current renewable installed capacity is.
Oh, golly. But let's get back to Europe here. There's been 5 years of really painstaking negotiations, and we have finally agreed on the Green Deal. Is that target for 2030 of 42% of renewables in the overall energy mix, is that consistent with that tripling you're talking about, or would more actually be needed?
So it's nearly tripling. It's something like a 2.5 times increase if you reach the 42 or even the 45%. And Europe seems to be on target. I mean, you probably know better than me the details, but what we're seeing is that Europe, with the measures they're now taking on the REPowerEU, the emergency measures, is actually now accelerating renewables, and we have a chance of meeting those targets in Europe. Our concern is not Europe or the US or even China. It is in those developing countries where we're not seeing the financial flows or the consequent renewable development that we need.
Right. But do I hear you say that, in fact, the European target is not consistent with the tripling?
No, it's not. In fact, none of the G7 countries are consistent with tripling. So although they signed the pledge at COP, they agreed to the commitment in the global stocktake text to triple globally, their countries are not actually on track to triple, or even their ambition. There's a huge ambition gap. So if you look at the national targets that are currently in place, they are way off track to the pathway towards tripling. There is an opportunity coming up, which is the NDC update, so the National Determined Contributions, which countries are obliged to update by the end of this year or early next year. And there's an opportunity to increase ambition, aligned with the 1.5 or the tripling, to include sector-specific targets, so quantity, but also quality, to have that in there like policies and plans that can get the implementation done. Because, we say targets are not turbines, or you could also say promises are not panels. Targets are not enough. You need, as you know, the policies on the ground, national frameworks to get it done and implementation of that. And again, we've seen that in Europe. So on the permitting side, the emergency measures that came in with REPowerEU dramatically accelerated the permitting where they were implemented. And Germany is a great example for that, for onshore wind.
Right, but would GRA be in favor of actually reviewing or reopening the framework with a view to getting the 2030 target of the EU on track for the tripling?
So we don't interfere or really involve ourselves too much with the EU policy. As we say, it's almost on track. And honestly, there's other groups that are here in Europe who deal with that much better than we could. As I say, we are more at the global commitment frameworks level, but also in the developing countries. What we do is actually point to some of the successes and best case examples of policy in Europe that we can then duplicate in other markets.
Let's talk a moment about that international framework, because there were actually significant developments at the last COP in Dubai. What exactly happened? How big is the, let's say, global governance backing for this tripling of renewables and doubling of energy efficiency?
So interestingly, I mean, the COP28, one could say is a good COP, not a bad COP. There was some very positive outcomes. So first of all, within the first few days, they reached an agreement on the loss and damage financing for developing countries. They then went on to follow that up with the final commitment in the GST text, which includes the doubling of energy efficiency rates, the tripling of renewable capacity, but also the transition away from fossil fuels, in line with science, aligned with 1.5 and Paris Agreement, and so on. Those are pretty critical additional elements to the tripling. That sends an extremely strong market signal. I mean, it's not legally binding, but what it does is show that all countries in the world are now committed to a renewable energy future. It also signals the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era, but just the beginning.
And essentially, this does move the, let's say, the international conversation a little bit away from the promises to the panels, as you were describing before. We'll get back to the COPs in a second, and to look ahead a little bit. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about Europe, because there's no doubt that the power sector in Europe is deeply committed. When we see the investment flows, the investment priorities, it's very much focused on renewables and clean. But we're also seeing a number of challenges emerge. The grids are glowing red many places in Europe. And on that background, I'm just wondering, how do you see a further increase of the pace in light of the challenges we're seeing on the ground now?
Well, it's great you say that, and that sort of anticipatory strategy, vision, and investments is required. So we must, take into account that these renewables will be developed, plus or minus, around the target, but significant new build renewables. So globally, we're seeing about 80% of additional capacity that's being added to the grid is renewable energy, primarily wind and solar. And as you say, those has an effect. And we've seen figures from Ember and others that, the combination of wind and solar in Europe is actually very complementary. Over the year, it's pretty well balanced, and across the year. But you're right that in the local grids, when you see, huge deployment of solar, the midday production does create, a surplus of power. And so what we're seeing in some markets now, Iberian Peninsula, for example, in the spring this year, where you see a lot of low, zero, or even negative pricing because of that large surplus of renewables during the day. We need to think very carefully about that. And the reports that Eurelectric is coming out points to some of the solutions, which is flexibility, it's storage, it's about the pricing. How do you actually price that to the end consumers so we can move the electrons, the green electrons, to a time when the demand is higher, the price is higher.
So talking about the grids in Europe, because this is one of the key challenges as we see it, adding to this relatively technically challenging transformation of the decentralization of the system, we have the fact that more than 30% of the distribution grids in Europe are more than 40 years old, and I'd imagine that there are probably similar trends internationally. I know that guys our age would insist that the 40s are the new 20s, but we probably also know that this is not always the case. How do you see us address this grid challenge in Europe and other places?
Yeah, so that's critical. And, in urgent investments are needed. And it's significant, hundreds of billions of euros in Europe, but it's trillions around the world. So our estimate is that we would need cumulatively 5 trillion, so $5,000 billion between now and 2030 for grid enhancement, new grid infrastructure, and enhancing and optimizing existing grid infrastructure. So it's huge. And the challenge is almost harder than renewables because the business case is not clear, and so the long-term business case for grids needs to be strengthened. So we need incentives, we need some level of long-term policy frameworks also to secure and incentivize grid investment globally.
Right. The other thing you were mentioning is very interesting and is really emerging as a key topic when it comes to investment. That is the death of the duck, as we say. The duck curve has been replaced by a very, very deep canyon, which means that essentially prices over the day sometimes are deep in the negative. Is this something you're seeing in other geographies, and how does GRA reflect on this? What is needed to come out of that canyon?
Well, I have to say we saw that coming. I mean, it's not a complex thing to see coming, but it's come much faster than we thought in some markets. It's going to come to most markets over the coming decades for sure, and so that's why we need to plan now. It's not just Europe. You see it in California, so it's wherever there's been large-scale renewable deployment, especially solar at scale. And where renewables, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula, and I was with the CEO of EDP, he was saying that they, this year, are at 97% renewable energy production, mainly because they had a lot of hydro this year, so the dams were full, so they could utilize hydro to balance the wind and solar. Now, that sounds great, but it also meant that, during the day, the power price was low, if not negative. So how do you, deal with that? Well, in the short term, it's very difficult. So you need to have a medium-term, long-term program of changing the pricing incentives, so whether it's the tariffs for the end consumer, or use technologies, so digitalization and storage to actually move to time travel the green electrons to later in the day. Also flexibility. And as you know, with electrification, the opportunity with EVs, for example, if you have a huge EV fleet that has V to G, vehicle to grid or vehicle to X, that can be used as storage capacity during the day when there's excess renewables, and even demand-side response, so large energy consumers that are able to shift their load. If incentivized to do so, they would do it. And so I think that's the vision we have. But you're right, it's come much faster than we thought. And so almost we're like a victim of our own success. If that continues, you're going to see potential challenges with investor confidence. Why would we invest if the offtake is not guaranteed?
Absolutely. Okay, let's look a little bit ahead. We've had a good COP last year. Now we're looking towards Baku, which apparently is going to be all about finance. And you've been talking about trillions and gazillions. It almost sounds like Scrooge McDuck needs to bring over his pile of money to fix this. What are your hopes for Baku?
Well, let's be honest, it is enormous amounts of money that needs to flow. It generally needs to flow, from the developed world to the developing countries. So there's the new collective quantified goals. So another acronym for you, NCQGs, which is basically the finance, the climate finance that they're looking at putting in place from developed countries to developing for mitigation and adaptation primarily. And that is trillions of dollars that's required to make that transition and a fair and just and equitable transition take place. But in addition to that, there are, of course, a lot of other finance in the world. What we see is that traditionally about 75 to 80% of the investment in clean energy has been from the private sector. So developers, private banks. And the other 10, 15, 20% has come from the public sector. So that's MDBs, so development banks, governments, and so on. So it's only a small amount that's needed from the public sector in order to de-risk projects to the point where our members, the developers, can then put their capital at risk and build the projects. But we're not seeing it in many countries because of the risk profile. There's almost like a perfect storm now in many markets where high interest rates, the cost of capital goes up, inflation is high, so the cost of supply chains go up, and also just risk generally, so currency risk or country risk. What we're also noting is that in many markets, the perceived risk is actually higher than the real risk. And so that also prices money above where it should be.
Back when I was involved in these negotiations, the sort of buzzwords for the developing world were new and additional money, and what the developed countries would give was few and traditional. I sometimes get the impression that, there's no money at all flowing, but what is the reality here? Is there a flow of money from developed countries to developing nations in context of the international climate negotiations?
Well, unfortunately, you're quite right. I mean, there is a reluctance on the part of many countries to put money, at work in other countries. I mean, our argument is that benefits not just themselves from a climate point of view, but also it creates new markets, opportunities, and resilience generally around the globe. I mean, geopolitics is an interesting and very dynamic piece, and what we're seeing is almost a move away from that towards national politics and protectionism, rather than that global community of trying to solve this. And I sense that if we had that really genuine global view, it would solve many of the problems you just identified.
Right. So what's next for GRA? Because Baku is sometime end of the year. What's going to happen in the meantime?
So just coming up soon, we've got our Global Renewables Summit, which we're launching at New York as part of the New York Climate Week and the UN General Assembly. That week is going to be packed with events and a lot of announcements and deliverables from us on finance. So we'll be doing a finance report, but also on trade, supply chains and grids and permitting to try and address some of those topics. I mean, we will be engaging with a lot of governments and other stakeholders to try and move that needle towards tripling. And then at Baku, obviously we'll be there present. The finance part of Baku is absolutely critical for us, so that'll be our main focus. It leads on to next year, and almost more important is the COP30 next year in Brazil, where we'll be taking all those things and elements, building on the national determined contributions, trying to raise ambition, but most importantly, change the national policies. So to get national policies in place. And so the combination, it's a powerful combination of long-term market signals and enabling frameworks with urgent action. And so we've just launched a while back our policy recommendations, which cover in detail those urgent actions that could be taken by governments. And they exist. This is not rocket science. So the good news is the technology exists, it's cost competitive, readily available, and the policies, we know what works and how to deploy it. We just need to get it deployed.
Around that time next year, probably there'll be a discussion in the EU about the 2040 framework and ambition. What's the name of your campaign for that?
I think we're going to stick with time for action, because honestly, my feeling is that even by next year, when the new European Parliament is in place and the new Commission is in place, that we'll still need action. And I think, we look to Eurelectric to support what we're doing here in Europe to get them to do, because honestly, Europe is a leader in the space in many respects, both renewable deployment, policy, and politics as well. And so we hope that those 2040 discussions also point to a faster and rapid transition towards a clean energy future.
The focus on delivery, you can definitely count on our support for that. Bruce Douglas, it was a great pleasure to have you with us. To all of you listening out there, make sure you comment below, engage in the conversation, ask us questions, and we'll get back to you. Thank you very much.